I think it's for everybody going through that sense of who am I in this? How can I continue to make a contribution? And what would it say if I chose to go a different route?
Welcome to the Free the PhD podcast, where we explore the ups and downs of academic life and career transitions. I'm your host and founder of Free the PhD, Bei Cao. Today, we'll be chatting with Dr. Annika Hylmo about her transition from academia into Hollywood and the world of media. Annika is a writer, director, and producer, and is working on a documentary and an original short called Psyche Ecology, a story we'd all relate to about the struggles of an introverted graduate student. We'll talk about her transition story, learn from her career journey, and see how you can help with the funding of Psyche Ecology. Dr. Hylmo received her PhD in communications from Purdue University.
My name is Annika Hylmo, and I have a PhD in communication from Purdue University. It's been a long journey, but I've ended up working in Hollywood, and that's what I'm doing these days. So I've gone from being a PhD in academia all the way over to being a writer, director, producer in Hollywood.
That's so amazing, though. I mean, these are the kinds of stories that people need to hear, that there's so many different opportunities to use the training and the research that you may have done in academia out in society. And
Yeah.
hopefully it's something that you really love doing, and that's what makes it all worth it.
Exactly. And it does come together in strange ways, unexpected ways sometimes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love to know a little bit about what inspired you or motivated you to go do your PhD in the first place.
That's a good question. I think part of it was just, well, what's the next thing to do after I'd finished my master's? I'd just gone through, all of my degrees are in communication one way or another. And communication is basically, it's storytelling. So when you study communication, it's all about storytelling and how stories connect with people and how we connect through our own storytelling. And I'd finished my master's at the time, and I'd just been very ill and was at a real crossroads and didn't know what else to do. And so I was almost like, well, what haven't I done? I haven't done a PhD, so I'm going to do a PhD. So that is a quirky way of doing it, but it's also, and it is true too. I was really at a place where I wasn't ready to think about the next step really, and it just made sense to go get the PhD. But at the same time, I've always been driven by curiosity. And that's what getting the PhD is all about. It's about investigation and exploring new things and making new discoveries. And that's what drove me to get the PhD.
Your story isn't that unusual. I think a lot of people kind of fall into a PhD, and some people go in with a specific goal in mind. But either way, I think there's many different reasons for doing it.
I agree, absolutely. And I don't regret it either. It was a good challenge. I'll tell you that. I think we can all relate to.
Can you give a brief abstract of what your project was in your PhD thesis project?
Mhm. So my dissertation was about telecommuting, so about distance remote workers and how they connected with the central location. And I was looking at the government and looking at how they were developing their telecommuting programs at that time, and the idea of remote work. And it was interesting because the stories that people would tell about it that were working on site compared to the people that were working remotely were very different. And so I was looking at how that storytelling shaped how they related to one another and what opportunities came for people out of that. And spent some time doing a lot of interviews, of course, because this was qualitative, and wrote a pretty good dissertation at the end of it.
That seems like a very relevant topic. It's just becoming more and more relevant in today's modern workforce.
I think it really is. And here in California, we've got such a mobile workforce, and it's becoming. I think you're up in Palo Alto. Are you?
Yeah, San
Yeah.
Francisco area,
San
yeah.
Francisco, yeah. So it's the same where we've got a lot of transient people, a lot of people that are working on their own. They even changed the laws just this past year. I just learned that they just changed the laws of the employment laws to kind of accommodate or not accommodate to however, depending on what side you're looking at it. But just because there's such a transient workforce, so many people are freelancing and become these tangential employees. or not. And the question is, are you an employee or are you not in the new laws? But yeah, a lot of us are working independently and love it, I have to say. And at the same time, I think we have to have very realistic expectations about what that means. And that definitely relates back to that work.
Yeah.
Mm.
So tell us about how you eventually made it into the Hollywood world, because that's really interesting. What was the
Mm.
first step that you took that really opened the doors out of academia?
Opening up the doors out of academia, I was doing some consulting side by side with my work in academia. I think I got to a point where I was a little bit frustrated because academia is, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, but for me, it felt like things were taking very long to shift and change. And I felt like I was doing a lot of research, but not necessarily having the immediate impact on the world that I wanted to. So I was doing some consulting to get more hands-on real life connections within the work. And simultaneously, I was writing a lot. I've always been very creative, and that's part of my story as well, that I I've been a singer for years. I took classical lessons throughout my bachelor's. Actually, I started when I was about 12, and so I have a lot of classical singing, classical music behind me, and done a lot of other art creative things, and always been writing creatively as well, side by side with it. So as I started to move into more of the consulting world, I also grew side by side within that, figuring out who's my target for this. And I was working in LA already. I moved back. I grew up in LA in part, and moved back to Los Angeles for work as an academic. And found that I was drawn more and more back into the creative arts, back into the industry. So my research was focusing more and more on movies anyway, sort of the stories that are being told in movies and how those are impacting teenage girls. And it's always been a passionate interest of mine, and what those stories are. So I was writing and consulting side by side. And while I was doing that, keeping an eye on the industry, all of a sudden an opportunity showed up, and that was to work at the American Film Institute, which is one of the premier film schools anywhere in the world. I put it in the category of the top 5 to 10, depending on how you look at it. But my job there, which initially I didn't want because I felt like it was going to be too analytical. I was just going, I don't want to sit in an office and just be an analyst all day long. And it was sort of a step backwards if I look at it from a career trajectory, and to say, what's the next step? And you want to build and you want to get a bigger, better job. And initially I looked at it, I was like, well, I'm just going to be doing an analysis all day long, and I don't want to do that. I get grumpy if I do that all day long. And then I looked at it, but it's AFI. And in this industry here in Hollywood, a lot of people don't know about that particular school or that particular organization outside of Hollywood, but it's one of the power players, so to speak. And so I was weighing it back and forth, to do this. And then at the end of the day, I was interviewing with them, and the fit was just so perfect. So that's the route that I ended up taking. So working at AFI, taking a step backward, as it were, actually pushed me forward a lot, because it gave me not only a lot of film education just by being immersed in that environment, but also wonderful friends and connections that came out of it, because really you become friends with, and that's what, when I left AFI, that's what kept pushing me onwards into the work that I'm doing today. So it was by taking a step backwards to take a step forward that I ended up being at a place where I feel more confident in my own storytelling and in my ability to serve others today.
Yeah, I think that story is also, I think it will resonate with a lot of people. I think people are afraid to do something they think is a step backwards, but
Yeah,
really, as long as it brings you towards a goal that you're passionate about, it always ends up being a step forward or a leap forward sometimes. So it's definitely
yeah.
a good lesson.
It really does. I think one lesson that I've learned along the way is that you have to get to know the industry that you're walking into. And that's a learning phase, and you really have to learn and respect it. You can't just step into it and think that you know everything because you got a PhD. It doesn't quite work that way. You got a lot to offer, but you also need to step in with a little bit of humility and be willing to learn from the ground up in
Yeah,
many ways.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a benefit that we do have is we really understand how to learn and how to learn efficiently. So I think,
Exactly.
especially as people who have been research trained in some way, you
Hmm.
should never be afraid to take a step back because you can
Yeah,
really
exactly.
jump forward after. So,
Yeah, it really becomes a jump forward. You don't realize it at the time, but it becomes a huge leap forward.
so, given that you have entered this world of entertainment,
Mhm.
could you tell us a little bit about the current project you're working on?
Sure. So I'm really fortunate. I'm working on two projects right now, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on one, my own project, because I got to promote that. But I'm working on two. I'm working on my own short, which is a proof of concept, and I'm working on a documentary. And I think that's also within this. It's multiple projects at the same time. So my short that I'm working on right now, it's a story about a woman who's finishing her dissertation in psychology, and she gets stuck. Nobody can relate to that. It's like this whole dark zone where there's nothing, 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 and she can't move forward. And in part because she's closed herself off to the rest of the world. And the way that she uncovers or unleashes everything is by moving home to her mother's house for a little while her mother's away. And she runs into a puppet character who turns out to be a psychic puppet. And this psychic puppet is insisting that she open up herself to the world that's outside and letting in her mother's psychic clients that are coming for psychic consultations, which she insists on being very analytical about and just really breaking everything down. So it's not until she finds a way of connecting both parts of herself, so both the analytical part and the more intuitive part, that she can actually flourish and blossom. So that's the story. It's a story that I've been developing for a number of years. Obviously, it's drawing a lot of my own experiences. It's having to go through. There was a time when every word that I could utter it had to have something to do with ology. Everything had to end in ology. It was epistemology, you know. It's like everything was all about ology. So you name an ology, and it was all my vocabulary. And it's hard when you're in that space. You can't really communicate with normal people because
Right.
that's not, that's not how normal people talk. Ideology, phenomenology and all of that. It's like, that's not how normal people talk. And so
I'm
a
always
lot of
asking people to see the paper. So, people are like, what are
it.
you talking about?
Exactly. Right. So how do I become a human being in this? And so a lot of the story has to do with that journey of sort of reconnecting with the self, even as you're going through the PhD. But it's got a lot of depth and layers to it, because it's that question of, in her case, her father is a PhD. He was a PhD in psychology and was a psychotherapist and so forth. And her mother was the more intuitive. And so it's connecting with both your mother and your father. It's accepting yourself as you're picking up on your mother's traits as much as you're picking up on your father's traits, which is something that I think a lot of women can relate to. There is a question of sort of the here and now versus family history, and what happens when you then lose a family member. How do you stay connected with them? So there's life and death in there. There's a question of, who do I become after doing this? Because I think part of what goes through, I know it went through my mind just working on the dissertation, is, okay, so this is almost done, then what? And there's not even enough time to stop and think about, who am I about to become? It's just, at that point, it was just apply for jobs, 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 and all of them were academic jobs. And so uh, when you're in that space, it's that dark zone when you can't really think clearly for yourself until you're willing to open up the door to other people and let people in and see that part of you. So it's it's a story that's been in development for a number of years. I've worked with some wonderful people from my AFI connections that have helped me to shape it, and now it's good to go. So it's been called an intellectual comedy. So I kind of like that.
So what's the name, and is there a release date already? Are there ways that people can go support it or check it out if they're interested?
Yeah. So right now, we are in the funding phase. So the title of it is Psyche Ecology, which plays on psychic and psychology. So somebody who is a psychicologist. So I guess I didn't get away from that ology after all. It's deeply ingrained.
It's part of who you are.
It's just a part of who I am. I can't get away from certain things. Exactly. It's like somebody tattooed it somewhere on me, and it's just sticking. So it's psychologist, and the phase where we're at right now is we have a script that is ready to go. So we're ready to film it, and have a bunch of people that are working in Hollywood, people whom I know, love, and trust, who are willing to come along the journey, but it's still going to cost a little bit of money. So we're in the funding phase, which means that right now we're doing two things. We're building the audience for it, and it's a funding phase. So to find out about it, it's to go to psychecologistmovie.com,
Mhm.
and that's our current platform. That's where we're funding right now. And we'd love for people to come along that journey. And then it's also drpenelopeproductions.com. Dr. Penelope is the puppet, who is kind of like a 9-year-old going on 99 in terms of her level of wisdom, I think. So either one of those places would be places to go. So right now we're funding. As soon as we're funded, then we're ready to go into production. And that will take, I think we're going to be filming for about 3 days. There's so much work that goes into this. It takes 3 days to film the thing. And after that, a couple of months of putting it together. So ideally, if we can, once we're funded, then we're good to go. And I'm hoping to have it out by the end of the year.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really interesting storyline. I obviously can see all of the different places that you've meshed your own experiences plus your own passions and interests. And I like the concept. It's very different. So I think it's about time that we examine different parts of like the research psyche, essentially. And there's so many
Yeah.
of us that go through very similar ordeals that hopefully some people can find resonance in the story that's being told here.
Yeah, I hope so. That's the intent. Obviously, this is anytime that you write something for the screen, it's just not for me, it's for other people as well. But I think that from a PhD perspective, it's not just about somebody who's coming out of a field like mine, coming out of communication. I think it's for everybody going through that sense of, who am I in this? How can I continue to make a contribution? And what would it say if I chose to go a different route? And as well as, how do I figure out these answers? Where do I find them? Because there's nobody really to sit down with you to figure that out often. We've got mentors, and we've got mentors, and we get professors, and people who are very keen on helping us. But oftentimes, I think, especially if you're stepping outside of academia, as both you and I have done, it's in that gray zone
Yeah.
where, everybody in academia, they're so intent on keeping you in academia. And people that are outside of academia don't understand academia. So you're kind of left to your own vices a little bit. And
It's challenging. Yeah.
yeah. And the only way that you can figure that out is really, it has to come from within. And that's what this story is about, because the puppet, she serves as a reflector of the internal, very, very much so, to bring out the voices that need to be spoken and that need to be said. And she does it by bringing in these other characters that, the main character, her name is Julia, so that Julia needs to meet along the way to serve as a mirror of herself. And it's really not until you're ready to open up to looking into that mirror that you start to discover something new about yourself, and who you really are, and your right path. So
Yeah. Well, that's great. So we'll definitely let people know about where to find out about the movie, how to support it. And
thank you.
do you have any last pieces of advice that you would like to leave for anyone who's in the middle of this sort of identity crisis, struggling to figure out what's next?
uh, I, my piece of advice would be to really trust yourself in this, and to not listen too much to other people, because there will be a lot of people around you going, so how come you're not teaching? How come you're not staying in academia? How come you've got a PhD? How come? And as well as, while you're going through it, you might not find your footing right away. And a lot of people will start to question that. So how come you've got a PhD? How come you can't figure it out? Well, we're human beings. So I think that would be one piece of advice. And the other piece we talked about a little bit before, and that is to not be afraid to take a step backwards, to try something out, and to learn another industry, what they need, because at the other end, you'll move forward that much faster. So that would be my piece of advice.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very valuable. And you've obviously been living out your own advice, and it seems to be working great. So I think people can take solace in that and hopefully be inspired to take their own steps.
I hope so. I hope so. Academia is wonderful in many ways, and I still feel like that whenever I step onto an academic campus. There is still that feeling like, oh my gosh, there's so much happening. It's so exciting, and for a lot of people, that's the right place. And I want to underscore that as well. And even if you find that you're stepping outside of academia for a little bit, you might find your way back into it as well. So don't discount the opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the barriers between academia and the rest of the world are now becoming more and more open. I think that there are definitely people who have gone in and out of academia. So yeah, I think seems like the opportunities are endless as long as people are willing to give it a try.
Exactly. I agree.
That wraps up my conversation with Dr. Annika Hylmo about her PhD transition into Hollywood and filmmaking. Don't forget to check out and support Dr. Hylmo's independent movie, Psyche Ecologist, which is currently in the funding phase. You can click the link in the description or go to www.drpenelopeproductions.com. Join us next time for more real talk about PhD life and career transitions from academia into the real world. I'm your host, Vei Kao, founder of Free the PhD. Join our email list for more supportive, practical advice for PhDs looking for a new career. And connect with Free the PhD on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Let us know if you have a PhD story to share or need help with your job hunt. Free the PhD is here to help. Thanks for listening.